Imagine a throne room lit not by mercy but by fire. Torches flared along stone walls, their shadows stretching like claws over the assembled court. At the center sat the king, robed in velvet, his crown glinting like a predator's eye. Before him knelt the broken men who had once dared to defy him. Their bodies bore the marks of chains, but the true torment had yet to begin, because the king had not summoned them to watch their own punishment. He had summoned them to watch their wives. Dragged forward by guards, the women stumbled onto the cold flagstones, their veils torn away, their gowns ripped open. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some of shock, some of guilty fascination. To strip a woman in public was no mere insult. In the medieval world, it was to destroy her family's honor forever, and that was precisely the king's intent. He did not need to kill these men. He only needed to make them live long enough to see their dignity annihilated. This was not lust. This was theater. A theater of domination, where humiliation became more powerful than execution. The wives were not individuals anymore. They were symbols, trophies of conquest. Their suffering was the king's spectacle, a performance designed to tell every noble in the realm, "Cross me, and your bloodline will be shamed into dust." The medieval age was an era of public punishments. Executions, floggings, and pillories filled town squares. But here humiliation took a darker, more intimate turn. The body was not only punished, it was politicized. The women's humiliation was a weapon sharper than any sword, because it carved wounds into pride, lineage, and memory. Even in societies accustomed to cruelty, such acts provoked whispers. Some chroniclers recorded them with disgust, others with admiration for the ruler's strength. Yet in both cases, the spectacle left a scar on history. Why would a king resort to such extremes? The answer lies in the psychology of power. For medieval rulers, the battlefield was never enough. Victory had to be etched into the souls of enemies, and nothing achieved that more effectively than turning their families into living symbols of defeat. To control a man's wife was to control his legacy, his masculinity, his very sense of worth. What unfolded in those throne rooms and courtyards was not just cruelty. It was a carefully calculated message. Every noble in attendance understood. If even the wives of proud warriors could be reduced to objects of ridicule, then no one was safe. Power was not about justice, nor even about survival. It was about spectacle, about making others tremble at the possibility of losing not just their lives, but their dignity. And yet, as chilling as this is, the story does not end there. For history records more than the humiliation itself. It records the consequences, the whispers that grew into rebellion, the scandals that shook courts to their foundations. Because while the king believed he was cementing his authority, he was also sowing the seeds of his downfall. But the real shock was yet to come. Power has always worn many masks, swords, crowns, armies. But in the medieval world, one of the most insidious masks was intimacy itself. To possess another person's body was not simply an act of desire. It was an act of control, a declaration that the boundaries of shame, honor, and sanctity meant nothing before the will of the ruler. For kings and conquerors, women were never just individuals. They were vessels of dynasties, symbols of continuity, and repositories of male pride. To strip them in public was to make a statement. I control not only your land and soldiers, but the very bloodline you hoped would outlast you. A wife's humiliation was more devastating than a warrior's death. The battlefield ended lives. The throne room spectacle destroyed legacies. Medieval chronicles reveal this grim logic time and again. When Viking raiders descended on monasteries and towns, they carried off women as spoils of victory, a ritualized demonstration that the defeated had lost not just their property, but their dignity. When Mongol armies stormed Eastern Europe, noble women were paraded in front of the conquered to remind them that resistance was futile. Even within European courts, kings like Ivan the Terrible turned humiliation into theater, forcing nobles to kneel as their wives or daughters were claimed by the state's cruelty. Why was this so effective? Because in a society built on honor, where family reputation determined one's survival, stripping a woman of dignity stripped the man of power. Her shame was his shame. Her public exposure was his silent execution. It was not the destruction of the body that mattered most. It was the destruction of identity. The psychology of control through intimacy is as old as power itself. To humiliate a man in battle is temporary. To humiliate him through his wife is permanent. It gnaws at memory, haunts lineage, and stains the family name long after the king who orchestrated it is gone. This was domination carried out not on the battlefield, but on the stage of human relationships. Yet we must not mistake these acts as mere cruelty or lust. They were calculated. A king who presided over such spectacles was engineering loyalty through terror. Each noble forced to watch understood that his survival and his family's survival depended on obedience. This was a weapon sharper than steel, the weapon of fear fused with shame. But power gained through humiliation has its limits. While it silenced many, it also bred hatred deeper than any tax or law could provoke. Those who endured such degradations never forgot, and often, neither did the chroniclers who recorded their stories. As one monk wrote of a warlord who paraded captive women, he sought to master not their flesh, but the hearts of all who watched. And this mastery through fear, this blending of desire with domination, set the stage for one of history's most disturbing scandals. When humiliation moved from whispered threat to public spectacle that shook the medieval world to its core. And that scandal was only just beginning. The chronicles of the Middle Ages are filled with tales of war and betrayal, but few match the chilling spectacle recorded in the reign of King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary in the 15th century. Renowned as a brilliant commander and patron of the arts, Matthias was also a ruler who understood that victory was not complete until it was carved into memory. And for him, nothing etched defeat deeper than the humiliation of enemies' families. One infamous episode followed his crushing defeat of a rebellious faction of Hungarian nobles who had secretly aligned with the Ottomans. These lords were dragged in chains to Buda, expecting execution, but the king had a different punishment in mind, one that would sting far more than the sword. In the great hall of his palace, before courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and churchmen, Matthias summoned the wives and daughters of the captured lords. The women were forced to stand in silence as guards tore away their veils and stripped them of the fine garments that had once signified their rank. To the stunned onlookers, the sight was a deliberate inversion of medieval values. A noblewoman's modesty was her armor, her dignity her crown. To take it away in public was to annihilate her family's honor. The defeated nobles were made to watch. Some cried out, others collapsed, but none could intervene. Their humiliation was total. Powerless men forced to bear witness as their wives became pawns in the king's theatre of dominance. Contemporary accounts describe Matthias seated upon his throne, his expression cold, almost clinical, as if cataloguing the ruin he had engineered. This was not an isolated case. Medieval rulers across Europe and the Near East employed similar tactics. Ivan the Terrible in Russia dragged boyar wives before the court to break their husband's pride. The Normans in England paraded Saxon noblewomen in chains after conquest. Even the Ottomans, whose sultans famously controlled vast harems, occasionally staged public humiliations of captive women as warnings to rebellious provinces. But Matthias's act stands out for its sheer spectacle. Deliberately staged in front of diplomats who would carry tales of his ruthlessness across Europe. The aftermath was immediate. The humiliated nobles swore eternal hatred, though most were powerless to act. The court itself fell into hushed silence, some praising the king's cunning, others recoiling at the cruelty. But the damage was done. Fear spread faster than rebellion. No one could mistake Matthias's message. Treason would not only cost you your freedom, but would stain your family for generations. For the women themselves, history offers few words. Their names are scarcely recorded, their voices erased. All that remains is the echo of their forced humiliation, immortalized not in their own accounts, but in the writings of men who watched in silence. They became unwilling instruments of power, a fate as tragic as it was unforgettable. And yet, such cruelty came with a price. Because when a ruler crosses the line from fear to disgust, even loyal subjects begin to question his authority. For Matthias and others like him, the humiliation of noble families was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of intrigue, whispers of rebellion, and betrayals that would haunt their thrones. But the most dangerous battles were not fought on fields of war. They unfolded in the secret chambers of politics and intimacy. Every throne room was more than a chamber of marble and banners. It was a stage. In medieval courts, power was rarely decided by swords alone. It was whispered in the shadows of bedchambers, traded in the embraces of mistresses, and secured in marriages that blurred the line between alliance and captivity. When kings humiliated the wives of their enemies, they were not just punishing rebels. They were weaponizing sexuality as part of a broader game of political chess. Consider the chilling logic. A king who stripped noblewomen of dignity in public could also promise protection or favor to those who submitted. What began as spectacle often bled into manipulation. Rival lords feared not only for their lands, but for their households. Women in these courts were forced into impossible roles, at times coerced into concubinage to secure their family's survival, at other times used as leverage in secret negotiations. The throne became not just a seat of power, but an altar where personal virtue was sacrificed for political gain. We see this dynamic echoed across history. In the Byzantine Empire, rumors swirled around emperors who used the humiliation of noblewomen to silence dissent, while in France, royal mistresses like Agnes Sorel reshaped entire factions through influence in the king's bed. Ivan the Terrible, infamous for his cruelty, forced boyar families into submission by violating not their fortresses, but their kin. In each case, intimacy was not private, it was a tool of governance. The court itself became complicit. Ambitious courtiers learned to weaponize gossip, spreading tales of who had fallen from the king's favor, or whose wife had been humiliated as punishment. These whispered scandals could destroy reputations faster than any battlefield defeat. And in the silence of cloisters, even priests and confessors became entangled, torn between condemning sin and preserving their place in the king's orbit. But humiliation carried risks. A ruler who relied on it too heavily risked eroding loyalty. Nobles might endure taxation, harsh laws, even war, but they could never forgive the dishonoring of their families. Behind jeweled curtains, plots thickened. Betrayed husbands whispered vengeance. Disgraced families sought foreign allies to restore their honor. Some queens themselves turned humiliation into a weapon, manipulating kings with reminders of shame inflicted on their rivals. The paradox was stark. By humiliating women, kings tightened their grip on power while simultaneously loosening the foundation beneath their thrones. For while fear commands silence, it does not command loyalty. It breeds resentment, the kind that festers in the dark until it erupts in rebellion. This is why the chronicles of medieval courts read less like sober histories and more like dramas of lust, betrayal, and downfall. A king's private cruelty could spark international crisis. A single act of humiliation could change the course of alliances, turning friends into enemies and enemies into conspirators. And inevitably, there came a moment when one act of humiliation went too far, when the spectacle meant to terrify instead ignited fury. That turning point would decide whether a king's cruelty cemented his rule or destroyed it forever. The throne room was only one part of the medieval stage. Beyond its walls, humiliation seeped into the fabric of daily life, shaping how men and women understood honor, marriage, and survival. To the common people, the public shaming of noble women was not just a scandal whispered about in taverns. It was a terrifying reminder of how fragile dignity truly was. In medieval society, honor was currency. For a peasant, it might be tied to his ability to provide for his family. For a knight, it was bound to his reputation on the battlefield. For a noble, it rested most heavily on the purity and dignity of his wife and daughters. A woman's body was not seen as her own, it was a reflection of her family's standing. Thus, when kings stripped noble women in public, they were not merely dishonoring individuals, they were rewriting the rules of lineage, identity, and worth. Ordinary people, who lived under the constant gaze of their lords, watched these spectacles with both dread and fascination. To them, the message was clear. If noble women, wrapped in silks and titles, could be humiliated, what chance did a villager's daughter or wife have against power? Fear filtered down through every class. A farmer's wife might not face the king's wrath, but she knew her vulnerability in a world where women's bodies were tokens of status and tools of negotiation. Cultural double standards ran deep. Noble women might be humiliated for spectacle, but peasant women were subjected to more private, unrecorded degradations. A landlord's demands, a soldier's passing cruelty, or a priest's abusive confession could reduce a woman to silence. What shocked the court as scandal was, for the lower classes, an unspoken reality. The difference was that nobles had the chroniclers to record their suffering, while the voices of the common women faded into the dust of time. Marriage itself was shaped by these fears. Husbands became protectors, not just of households, but of reputation, guarding their wives' modesty as if it were a fortress. To lose that modesty, willingly or by force, was to lose honor, often irreparably. This belief reinforced patriarchal control, binding women to the roles of property and symbol rather than person. Even religion echoed this system, framing chastity as a divine virtue while rarely condemning the rulers who shattered it for political spectacle. And yet, beneath the surface, resistance existed. Songs, folktales, and whispered prayers carried the memory of humiliation, turning it into cautionary tales. A woman shamed by a king might be remembered in peasant lore as a tragic figure, her suffering a symbol of tyranny's injustice. These cultural undercurrents mattered because they kept alive the idea that such acts were not only cruel, but dangerous, that they could bring down curses, rebellions, and divine wrath. Daily life in the medieval world was already harsh, but spectacles of humiliation reminded everyone, from nobles to peasants, of a darker truth. The body was never fully one's own. It was always vulnerable to the gaze, the judgment, and the power of those above. But when humiliation crossed the invisible line between fear and outrage, a reckoning always followed. Every reign built on fear eventually reaches its breaking point. For the king who made humiliation his favorite weapon, the moment came not on a battlefield, but in his own hall, when one act of cruelty tore the veil from his authority and revealed only naked tyranny. The scandal began like so many before it. After quelling a rebellion of nobles who had secretly conspired with foreign powers, the king prepared his usual spectacle. Once again, the defeated were dragged into court. Once again, their wives were forced before the throne, stripped of the dignity that had defined their station. The courtiers expected silence, perhaps muffled sobs, perhaps the hollow gaze of men broken by shame. But this time, something changed. One noblewoman, her name lost to history, but her defiance remembered, did not bow her head. As guards tore away her veil, she lifted her chin and fixed her eyes upon the king. In that stare was no submission, no fear. Witnesses later wrote that the hall fell silent, as if every soul felt the balance of power shift. Her husband, though in chains, wept not from humiliation, but from pride. In that instant, the king's theatre failed. The spectacle meant to break spirits instead kindled a spark of rebellion. Whispers spread like wildfire. Chroniclers in foreign courts wrote of the event with outrage. The church, long cautious in criticizing kings, began to stir. Priests used sermons to hint that no ruler, however anointed, could degrade Christian matrons without inviting divine wrath. Among the nobility, even those who had once applauded the king's ruthlessness, now muttered in secret that he had gone too far. Humiliation, once a weapon of fear, had transformed into proof of his cruelty. And cruelty has a way of isolating kings. Loyal courtiers began to hedge their bets, quietly preparing alliances in case the crown faltered. Ambassadors carried home reports not of strength but of scandal, tarnishing the monarch's reputation abroad. The king, who had once wielded humiliation as an instrument of absolute control, now found himself painted as a despot who mistook degradation for governance. The turning point was not merely political, it was psychological. For years, the king had thrived on the silence of the humiliated, but silence broke that day. The courage of one woman to stand unbowed revealed the fragility of his rule. His authority had never been built on loyalty, only on terror. And terror, once challenged, often collapses like a fortress riddled with cracks. The aftermath was slow but inevitable. Rebellions simmered, plots thickened. Some noble families, desperate to restore their honor, turned to foreign allies, even offering their daughters' hands in marriage to rival kings in exchange for support. In time, the ruler who had thought himself untouchable became the hunted, haunted by whispers, betrayed by those he once trusted, undone by the very spectacle that had once kept him feared. This was the paradox of humiliation. The more it was used, the more it eroded the foundation beneath the throne. The king believed he was writing his enemy's shame into eternity. Instead, he wrote his own downfall. But even downfall was not the end, for the consequences of such acts outlived him, shaping the politics and morality of centuries to come. The downfall of a ruler seldom ends with his death. What he does in life echoes across generations, carried in lore, legend, and cultural memory. The medieval king who turned humiliation into theatre may have believed he was stamping his authority into history, but in truth, he stamped his infamy. His spectacle became a warning to rulers, to nobles, and even to the church, that humiliation could fracture empires as surely as swords. In the years that followed, the king's reputation blackened. Chroniclers, once cautious in their words, began to write freely of his cruelty. One monk recorded bitterly, "He thought to rule by shame, but his shame rules him still." Even foreign courts used his scandal as propaganda, contrasting their own justice against his barbarity. The act that had been meant to display strength instead became evidence of weakness. A king so insecure he had to destroy women's dignity to secure men's obedience. The consequences reached deeper than reputation. Among the nobility, families that had suffered humiliation nursed their grievances for decades. Marriages were arranged with foreign dynasties to regain honor, forging alliances that would one day challenge the king's successors. In this way, a single spectacle of degradation rippled outward, reshaping the balance of power across borders. Religion, too, absorbed the scandal. The church, already uneasy with rulers who flaunted moral codes, began to sharpen its stance on public decency. Humiliation of women, once tolerated as spoils of war, increasingly came under condemnation. By the late medieval period, councils and sermons spoke more openly of the sin of sexual cruelty, framing it as not only immoral, but dangerous to the stability of Christendom. Though far from eradicating abuse, this moral shift marked the beginning of a slow cultural backlash. Ordinary people also carried the memory. In folk tales and whispered ballads, kings who humiliated women were cast not as heroes, but as tyrants cursed by God. Stories told of rulers who met grisly ends, poisoned, betrayed, or struck down in divine retribution, serving as cautionary tales against excess. Even when history blurred fact with legend, the message endured. Power without restraint invited ruin. And what of the broader legacy? The scandal left an imprint on law and custom. In some kingdoms, stricter codes emerged around the treatment of captives, particularly noble women, not from compassion, but from calculation. Rulers saw that unchecked humiliation bred rebellion, not loyalty. By the Renaissance, public shaming rituals shifted form, focusing more on criminals and heretics than on noble wives, as monarchs sought to distance themselves from the stain of their predecessors. Yet echoes remained. From the Ottoman courts to the French monarchy, rulers continued to exploit intimacy and humiliation, though often with greater secrecy. And in modern times, the same principle survives, not in throne rooms, but in propaganda, scandals, and the public spectacle of disgrace. The body and its dignity remain battlegrounds where power is contested. Thus, the legacy of that medieval king was twofold. He secured his place in history, but not as he intended. His cruelty became a mirror in which later generations saw the danger of confusing fear with authority. His throne crumbled, but the memory of his acts outlived the stones of his palace, and those echoes reach even further, into the modern age, where public humiliation remains one of the most powerful weapons of control. The image of a medieval king seated on his throne, forcing his enemies to watch their wives stripped and humiliated, lingers like a shadow across history. It is tempting to consign such cruelty to a distant, barbaric past, a relic of an age when power was measured in public spectacles of shame. Yet, if we look closer, we find that the logic of humiliation has never truly disappeared. It has merely changed form. In the medieval world, humiliation was physical, immediate, and public. A noblewoman's torn veil or a prisoner's chained body declared that the king's power was absolute. Today, rulers no longer gather their enemies in stone halls. Yet the principle of breaking dignity to assert control still thrives in political scandals, smear campaigns, digital shaming, and propaganda staged for mass consumption. Whether through tabloids, televised trials, or viral images, the spectacle of disgrace remains a weapon as potent as any sword. This continuity forces us to confront a grim truth. Humanity's appetite for humiliation is enduring. Just as medieval crowds gasped at the stripping of noblewomen, modern audiences cannot look away from the exposure of private failures, the downfall of celebrities, or the collapse of reputations. We may cloak it in the language of accountability or entertainment, but at its heart, the spectacle still feeds the same hunger, to see others reduced, and to measure our own safety against their ruin. The medieval king, who weaponized humiliation, believed he was writing his dominance into eternity. Instead, he wrote a cautionary tale. His throne crumbled, his reputation curdled, and his acts became warnings preserved in chronicles and sermons. The lesson is stark. Power that relies on degrading others breeds not loyalty, but resentment, not stability, but rebellion. And while fear may silence voices for a time, dignity once destroyed can also become the spark of defiance. For the women who endured such spectacles, history gave little voice. Their names faded, their suffering recorded only as a footnote to male ambition. Yet their silent endurance, or their defiance in the face of degradation, speaks across centuries. It reminds us that even when power reduces people to objects, the human spirit can resist, if only in the refusal to break. As we close this story, the questions it raises remain urgent. How far will leaders go to secure their rule? How often do societies become complicit in cruelty disguised as justice or spectacle? And what does it say about us, that humiliation, whether in a medieval hall or on a modern screen, still draws such fascination? History whispers its warning. Power built on shame may dazzle for a season, but it corrodes from within. Kings, emperors, and even modern rulers who mistake humiliation for governance will always discover the same fate. Respect born of fear is respect that cannot last. So we end with the same haunting reflection with which we began. The stripping of dignity is not just an act of cruelty, it is an act of legacy. And the question is not whether history remembers, but how it remembers. What other secrets, buried beneath the dust of time, still wait to remind us that the darkest truths of power are never as far away as we think?